The salt spray stung General Douglas MacArthur's weathered face as he stood on the deck of the USS Mount McKinley, his penetrating gaze fixed on the treacherous coastline of Inchon. It was September 14, 1950, and the tide of war had turned blood red against United Nations forces in Korea. Behind him lay the smoking ruins of Seoul. Ahead stretched 30-foot tidal flats that military experts deemed impassable for amphibious assault. "General, the Joint Chiefs are calling this operation military suicide," whispered his aide, Colonel Edward Almond, his voice barely audible above the churning engines of the invasion fleet. MacArthur's jaw tightened, his famous corncob pipe clenched between his teeth. For 3 months, North Korean forces had driven Allied troops into the desperate perimeter around Pusan, threatening to push them into the sea entirely. The morning briefing had been grim. Intelligence reports confirmed that Kim Il-sung's Korean People's Army controlled 90% of the Korean peninsula. American casualties mounted daily as the 8th Army clung to their shrinking foothold. President Harry Truman faced mounting pressure from Congress. While critics questioned America's commitment to this distant Asian conflict, MacArthur had studied the ancient port of Inchon for weeks, poring over Japanese colonial maps and interviewing Korean fishermen who knew these waters. The city sat like a fortress behind mud flats that stretched endlessly at low tide, accessible only during the brief window when spring tides reached their peak. Most military strategists dismissed the location as impossible. Exactly why MacArthur believed it would succeed. The general's mind drifted to his conversation with Admiral James Doyle 3 days earlier. "Doug, those tides rise 30 feet in 6 hours," Doyle had warned, his naval expertise evident in every concerned word. "Miss that window, and your entire force will be stranded on mud flats, sitting ducks for North Korean artillery." But MacArthur saw opportunity where others saw obstacles. According to declassified Pentagon documents from the Truman Presidential Library, the operation required precise timing that bordered on the miraculous. The assault forces would have exactly 3 hours at high tide to navigate the narrow Flying Fish Channel, scale 15-foot seawalls, and establish a beachhead before the waters receded again. Standing in the pre-dawn darkness, MacArthur watched the final preparations unfold across the massive flotilla. 261 vessels stretched across the horizon: destroyers, cruisers, transport ships, and landing craft loaded with the 10th Corps' finest Marines and soldiers. The 1st Marine Division, veterans of Pacific campaigns, checked their equipment one final time, while Royal Marine Commandos from Britain prepared for their supporting assault. The stakes couldn't be higher. Success at Inchon would cut North Korean supply lines, isolate their forces around Pusan, and potentially end the war before winter set in. Failure would mean the destruction of an entire corps, and possibly America's complete withdrawal from Korea. MacArthur's reputation, built on decades of military brilliance, hung in the balance alongside thousands of young lives. As the first pale light of dawn touched the eastern horizon, MacArthur raised his binoculars and studied the silent shore. Somewhere beyond those mud flats and seawalls lay Seoul, the prize that would justify this enormous gamble. The general's aide approached quietly, holding the final meteorological report confirming optimal tidal conditions. "Gentlemen," MacArthur announced to his staff, his voice carrying the authority of absolute conviction, "we shall land at Inchon." The thunder of naval gunfire shattered the pre-dawn stillness as Admiral Arthur Struble's task Force 77 opened the preliminary bombardment at precisely 5:45 a.m. on September 15th. Heavy cruisers USS Rochester and Toledo hurled 8-inch shells into Wolmedu Island, the fortified sentinel guarding Inchon's approaches, while destroyers Mansfield and De Haven moved closer to shore, their 5-inch guns seeking out North Korean positions with methodical precision. Lieutenant Colonel Raymond Murray, commanding the 1st Battalion, 5th Marines, crouched in the lead landing craft as it approached the narrow channel. Around him, his Marines adjusted their gear with practiced efficiency, their faces grim beneath camouflaged helmets. These men had fought across Pacific atolls against Japanese defenders, but nothing had prepared them for the unique challenges of Inchon's geography. The plan required split-second coordination between multiple assault forces, while the main landing targeted Inchon proper. A diversionary attack on Wolmi-Do Island would neutralize the coastal batteries that could devastate the invasion fleet. Colonel Lewis Puller's 1st Marine Regiment would spearhead the primary assault, supported by elements of the 7th Infantry Division under Major General David Barr. Captain Eugene Clark, a naval intelligence officer who had spent weeks behind enemy lines, watched the bombardment from his concealed position on Yonghung-Do Island. His reconnaissance had provided crucial intelligence about North Korean defensive positions, confirming MacArthur's assessment that Inchon remained lightly defended. The enemy had concentrated their forces around Pusan, never expecting an assault on this seemingly impossible coastline. As reported in contemporary accounts from the Marine Corps' historical foundation, the morning assault on Wolmi-Do proceeded with remarkable efficiency. The 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines stormed ashore at 6:30 a.m., overwhelming the surprised North Korean garrison within 45 minutes. Radio operator Staff Sergeant Robert Taplett's voice crackled across the command frequency. Wolmi-Do secured, minimal casualties, proceeding to phase line Baker. The success on Wolmi-Do boosted morale throughout the invasion fleet, but the real test lay ahead. The main landing at Inchon would not commence until evening high tide, giving North Korean commanders precious hours to organize their defenses and rush reinforcements to the threatened sector. MacArthur paced the Mount McKinley's bridge, monitoring radio reports while calculating wind speed and tidal predictions. Major General Oliver Smith, commanding the 1st Marine Division, reviewed final assault plans with his regimental commanders. Intelligence suggested that Colonel Kim Kyu-sik's North Korean garrison numbered fewer than 2,000 troops, but urban combat would favor the defenders. Seoul lay just 25 miles inland, connected to Inchon by a single highway that would become the invasion's primary objective. Once the beachhead was secured, the afternoon hours dragged endlessly as Marines and soldiers waited in their landing craft, seasickness mixing with pre-battle anxiety. Naval gunfire continued intermittently, probing suspected enemy positions, while Marine corsairs from the carriers Sicily and Botawang Strait strafed suspected strongpoints. The airstrikes revealed how thinly the North Koreans had spread their defenses, confirming MacArthur's strategic insight. At 4:30 p.m., the tide began its crucial rise toward the evening peak. Landing craft engines roared to life as coxswains maneuvered their vessels into formation for the final approach. The Flying Fish Channel stretched ahead like a narrow corridor between treacherous mudflats, requiring perfect navigation to avoid grounding on the shifting bottom. Colonel Murray's Marines could see Inchon's distinctive seawall looming through the afternoon haze, its 15-foot height representing the last obstacle before establishing their foothold on Korean soil. Scaling ladders had been distributed throughout the assault force, while combat engineers prepared Bangalore torpedoes to breach any strong points they encountered. The general's bold gamble was about to face its ultimate test as evening shadows lengthened across the Yellow Sea, and 30,000 Allied troops prepared to write their names in military history. The evening of September 15th brought perfect tidal conditions, as Admiral Strubel's bombardment fleet unleashed a crescendo of destruction upon Inchon's waterfront. The heavy cruiser USS Toledo's 8-inch guns methodically demolished suspected strong points along the seawall, while destroyers moved dangerously close to shore, their rapid-fire batteries seeking out machine gun nests and artillery positions that might oppose the landing. Lieutenant Robert Bone gripped the sides of his landing craft as it approached Red Beach, the designated assault zone directly below Inchon's commercial district. Around him, Marines from Company Able, 1st Battalion, 5th Regiment checked their weapons one final time. The boat's coxswain, Petty Officer 3rd Class James Martinez, navigated carefully through the narrow channel, avoiding the treacherous mud banks that could strand them helplessly until the next high tide 12 hours later. 30 seconds, shouted Bone above the roar of engines and gunfire. His Marines rose in unison, their bayonets glinting in the fading light. The seawall loomed ahead, its concrete face pockmarked by naval shells but still formidable. Scaling ladders had been pre-positioned in each craft, but reaching them would require the Marines to cross several yards of exposed beach under potential enemy fire. The first wave struck Red Beach at 17:30 hours with devastating effect. North Korean defenders, stunned by the afternoon bombardment, offered only scattered resistance as Marines swarmed over the seawall using ladders, ropes, and sheer determination. Staff Sergeant Harold Royce led his squad through a breach created by naval gunfire, immediately establishing a defensive perimeter while follow-up waves expanded the beachhead. Simultaneously, Blue Beach witnessed the landing of the 1st Battalion, 1st Marines under Lieutenant Colonel Jack Hawkins. These veterans moved with practiced efficiency through Inchon's narrow streets, their tactical discipline honed by years of Pacific warfare. The North Korean garrison, estimated at fewer than 400 effectives in the immediate area, proved unable to coordinate effective resistance against the multi-pronged assault, as documented in official Marine Corps battle reports held at Quantico's archives. The speed of the American advance surprised even optimistic planners. By 1900 hours, forward elements had seized the crucial intersection of routes 1 and 18, cutting the main supply line between Seoul and the southern battlefront, where North Korean forces continued their attacks on the Pusan perimeter. Major General Smith established his division command post in a commandeered warehouse near the harbor, immediately coordinating the landing of heavy equipment and supplies. LST's landing ship tank vessels approached the seawall during peak tide, their massive ramps disgorging Sherman tanks, artillery pieces, and ammunition stocks essential for the advance inland. The logistics operation proceeded with remarkable smoothness despite the challenging geography. Colonel Kim Cusick, commanding North Korean forces in the Inchon sector, attempted to organize a counterattack using reserve units positioned around Kimpo airfield. However, Marine Corsairs from VMF-114 and VMF-323 squadrons maintained continuous air cover, strafing enemy columns before they could reach the threatened beachhead. Pilot Captain John Glenn reported destroying several T-34 tanks attempting to move toward the landing zones. By midnight, the beachhead extended nearly 2 miles inland with minimal casualties. The gamble that military experts had deemed impossible was succeeding beyond MacArthur's most optimistic projections. Radio communications with the 8th Army around Pusan confirmed that North Korean pressure there was already decreasing as enemy commanders began shifting reserves northward to counter the unexpected threat. The general himself came ashore at 2300 hours, wading through knee-deep water with characteristic theatrical flair while photographers captured the moment for posterity. The Navy and Marines have never shone more brightly than this morning, MacArthur declared to assembled correspondents, his confidence vindicated by the day's remarkable achievements. However, the real test lay ahead as North Korean forces recovered from their initial surprise and began concentrating forces for a major counteroffensive. Intelligence reports indicated that Kim Il-sung was ordering the withdrawal of several divisions from the Pusan front, potentially giving General Walton Walker's 8th Army the breathing space needed for their own offensive operations. The first phase of Operation Chromite had exceeded all expectations, but Seoul still lay 25 miles inland, defended by increasingly desperate enemy forces who understood that losing the capital might end their hopes of conquering South Korea. Dawn on September 16 revealed the stunning scope of the Inchon victory as Marine patrols advanced through abandoned North Korean positions, discovering artillery pieces, supply dumps, and defensive positions hastily evacuated during the night. The speed of the collapse surprised even veterans who had witnessed Japanese resistance crumble across Pacific battlefields. But this enemy was retreating rather than fighting to the death. Lieutenant Colonel Raymond Murray's 2nd Battalion, 5th Marines spearheaded the advance toward Kimpo Airfield, the strategic prize that would provide close air support for the drive on Seoul. Intelligence indicated that North Korean forces were attempting to establish defensive lines along the Han River, but their hasty withdrawal suggested panic rather than organized resistance. The road to Seoul stretched before the advancing columns like a ribbon through rice paddies, and small villages where Korean civilians emerged cautiously from hiding places, many weeping with joy at seeing American uniforms. Captain Francis Fenton, commanding Fox Company, reported that his Marines were being greeted as liberators in villages that had endured 3 months of brutal North Korean occupation. MacArthur's strategic brilliance became increasingly apparent. As reports arrived from multiple fronts, General Walker's 8th Army had begun their breakout from the Pusan perimeter, exploiting the enemy's confusion. As North Korean commanders struggled to respond to threats from both north and south, the KPA's carefully constructed defensive lines were collapsing as units were rushed toward Seoul. To contain the Inchon landing, Major General Smith coordinated the multi-pronged advance with characteristic precision, sending the 5th Marines toward Kimpo while the 1st Marines secured Inchon and established supply lines for the sustained offensive ahead. The 7th Infantry Division, now fully ashore, prepared to cross the Han River south of Seoul, potentially encircling any North Korean forces that attempted to defend the capital. According to classified intelligence summaries later declassified by the National Security Archive, Kim Il-sung's government was already making preparations to evacuate Seoul and retreat toward the Chinese border. Radio intercepts revealed growing panic among North Korean commanders as they realized the magnitude of their strategic disaster. By September 18th, Kimpo Airfield fell to advancing Marines after token resistance from a demoralized garrison that had been expecting reinforcements for 2 days. Combat engineers immediately began repairing the runways, while Marine aviation units prepared to establish forward operating bases, dramatically shortening the time between close air support requests and aircraft arrival over target areas. The psychological impact of the Inchon landing reverberated throughout Korea. As word spread that MacArthur's forces were advancing on Seoul, South Korean civilians who had been forced into hiding emerged to provide intelligence about North Korean positions, while guerrilla groups that had been operating behind enemy lines coordinated their attacks. With the advancing UN forces, Lieutenant Colonel Homer Litzenberg's 7th Marines, recently arrived from the Mediterranean, began their approach to Seoul's outskirts as North Korean resistance stiffened noticeably. The enemy had positioned T-30 for tanks and anti-tank guns in prepared positions along the main approaches to the capital, suggesting that the easy victories of the first 3 days were ending. Colonel Louis Puller, commanding the 1st Marines, reported increasing enemy activity along his front as North Korean reinforcements arrived from the Chinese border. These units were better equipped and more determined than the garrison troops encountered at Inchon, indicating that the final battle for Seoul would test American resolve and tactical skill. The strategic situation had been completely reversed in less than 72 hours, where North Korean forces had been on the verge of pushing UN troops into the sea. They now faced potential annihilation. As MacArthur's pincers closed around their overextended armies, the 8th Army's breakout from Pusan was gaining momentum daily as enemy resistance cracked under pressure from multiple directions. However, intelligence reports suggested that Chinese advisors were already present in North Korea, raising the specter of international escalation if MacArthur's forces approached the Yalu River. The tactical triumph at Inchon had created strategic opportunities and dangers that would shape the conflict's future development. That September 22nd brought the first serious resistance as Colonel Chesty Puller's 1st Marines encountered North Korean defensive positions along the approaches to Seoul. The enemy had established roadblocks, minefields, and mutually supporting strong points designed to channel attacking forces into killing zones, where pre-registered artillery could devastate advancing columns. Staff Sergeant Robert Taplett led his squad through the rubble-strewn streets of Yeongdeungpo, Seoul's industrial suburb, where North Korean regulars had fortified factories and apartment buildings into formidable defensive positions. The urban combat required different tactics than the rapid advance from Inchon, as each building potentially concealed snipers, machine gun nests, or anti-tank weapons capable of destroying American armor. The political stakes heightened dramatically as reports reached MacArthur that President Rhee's government was preparing to return to Seoul. eager to demonstrate restored South Korean sovereignty. However, the capital remained contested territory where North Korean forces fought with increasing desperity. Understanding that losing Seoul might trigger their complete collapse, Major General Smith coordinated a three-pronged assault designed to encircle Seoul while minimizing civilian casualties and infrastructure damage. The 5th Marines would cross the Han River north of the city. The 1st Marines would attack from the west, and elements of the 7th Infantry Division would establish blocking positions to prevent enemy withdrawal toward North Korea. Combat engineers under Captain Bruce Williams worked frantically to bridge the Han River. Despite persistent enemy artillery fire from positions within Seoul, the North Koreans had destroyed all existing bridges during their retreat, forcing American forces to construct temporary spans under combat conditions, while maintaining the momentum of their advance. As documented in official Army historical records maintained at Fort McNair, the first serious tank battle occurred on September 24th, when North Korean T-34s engaged Sherman tanks from the 72nd Tank Battalion. Near Seoul's western suburbs, Lieutenant Colonel Harry Summers reported destroying 6 enemy vehicles, while losing to American tanks, demonstrating the tactical superiority of American combined arms doctrine. The psychological warfare aspect intensified as leaflets dropped by Marine aviation units promised safe conduct to North Korean soldiers who surrendered, while loudspeakers broadcast surrender appeals in Korean. Many enemy soldiers, particularly those conscripted from South Korean populations, began deserting their positions as it became apparent that the war's momentum had shifted decisively. Captain Eugene Franklin's company Baker, 1st Battalion, fought a fierce engagement for Seoul University, where North Korean forces had established a regimental command post. The battle raged for 6 hours before Marine assault teams finally cleared the complex, discovering maps and documents that revealed the enemy's deteriorating tactical situation throughout the Seoul area. By September 25th, advanced elements of the 5th Marines had penetrated Seoul's northern districts, while the 1st Marines approached the government district from the southwest. Radio intercepts indicated that North Korean commanders were requesting permission to withdraw across the 38th parallel, but Kim Il-sung's government insisted on holding the capital at all costs. The street fighting intensified as North Korean forces made their final stand around key government buildings and transportation centers. These defenders fought with suicidal determination, understanding that retreat meant abandoning their invasion of South Korea and potentially facing Chinese criticism for their military failures. Major General Almond, commanding the 10th Corps, established his forward command post in Kimpo to coordinate the final assault, while ensuring adequate supplies reached combat units. The logistics challenge was enormous, as every round of ammunition, gallon of fuel, and medical supply had to be transported over 25 miles of vulnerable roads from Inchon. Intelligence reports confirmed that the 8th Army's breakout from Pusan was accelerating as North Korean resistance collapsed throughout southern Korea. General Walker's forces had advanced over 50 miles in 3 days, linking up with South Korean units and liberating major cities that had been under enemy occupation. Since the war's opening weeks, the strategic situation had been completely transformed. Where Kim Il-sung's forces had controlled 90% of Korea just 2 weeks earlier, they now faced potential annihilation as UN forces closed in from multiple directions. MacArthur's gamble at Inchon had achieved results beyond even his optimistic projections. The morning of September 26 dawned with the sound of freedom bells ringing across Seoul, as advance elements of the 5th Marines secured the South Korean capital's government district. Lieutenant Colonel Raymond Murray's battalion raised the American flag over the Capitol building at precisely 1100 hours, symbolically ending 3 months of North Korean occupation and vindicating MacArthur's strategic brilliance. President Syngman Rhee's return to Seoul later that day provided dramatic confirmation of South Korea's restoration. The elderly leader, accompanied by MacArthur himself, walked through streets lined with cheering civilians who had emerged from hiding to witness their liberation. Korean families wept openly as they recognized that the nightmare of communist occupation was ending. The military situation had transformed completely since the desperate days of early September, when UN forces clung to the Pusan perimeter. North Korean armies that had seemed invincible just weeks earlier were now retreating in disorder, their supply lines severed and their morale shattered by the unexpected reversal of fortune. Colonel Louis Puller's 1st Marines completed the systematic clearing of Seoul's remaining strong points, while combat engineers began restoring essential services. The North Korean withdrawal had been so precipitous that many military supplies were abandoned intact, including artillery pieces, vehicles, and ammunition stocks that would prove valuable. For UN forces, intelligence reports painted a picture of complete North Korean collapse throughout the peninsula. The 8th Army's link-up with advanced elements from Inchon occurred on September 27 near Osan, effectively trapping thousands of enemy soldiers between converging UN forces. Many North Korean units simply dissolved as soldiers discarded their uniforms and attempted to blend into civilian populations. According to declassified documents from the MacArthur Memorial Archives, the Inchon landing had achieved results that exceeded even the general's most optimistic projections. What had been planned as an operation to relieve pressure on Pusan had evolved into a complete strategic victory that restored South Korean independence and demonstrated American resolve. Throughout the Cold War world, the human cost of the operation proved remarkably light considering its strategic importance. Marine casualties totaled fewer than 500 killed and wounded during the entire Seoul operation, while North Korean losses were estimated in the tens of thousands when prisoners, deserters, and combat casualties were totaled. The speed of victory had minimized the destruction that prolonged urban combat might have caused. MacArthur's press conference on September 28 became legendary, as the general described the operation's success to assembled international correspondents. The enemy's supply line has been severed, his communication disrupted, and his army split into two elements. MacArthur declared with characteristic confidence, "The battle for Korea is essentially over." However, ominous signs were already appearing on the strategic horizon. Chinese advisors had been observed with North Korean units, while diplomatic protests from Beijing suggested that Communist China would not accept the complete destruction of Kim Il-sung's regime. Intelligence analysts warned that pursuit of North Korean forces toward the Yalu River might provoke Chinese intervention. The tactical brilliance of the Inchon landing had created strategic opportunities and dangers that would define the war's next phase. UN forces now controlled most of Korea south of the 38th parallel, but decisions about pursuing retreating enemies into North Korea would test international resolve and potentially expand the conflict beyond the Korean peninsula. South Korean civilians began the massive task of rebuilding their war-torn nation, while American forces prepared for what many hoped would be the conflict's final phase. The port of Inchon, once considered impossible to assault, had become the staging area for what appeared to be total victory over communist aggression in Northeast Asia. The strategic reversal achieved in just 2 weeks would be studied in military academies for generations as an example of how bold leadership and innovative tactics could overcome seemingly impossible odds and achieve decisive victory against determined enemies. The final accounting of Operation Cromite revealed the true magnitude of MacArthur's strategic triumph, as UN intelligence officers compiled comprehensive assessments of the campaign's impact throughout the Korean peninsula. By October 1, 1950, North Korean forces had been pushed back across the 38th parallel for the first time since their initial invasion 3 months earlier. The 8th Army's liberation of South Korean territory proceeded with remarkable speed as demoralized North Korean units surrendered en masse or simply melted away into the civilian population. Cities that had endured months of brutal communist occupation were freed within days. As UN forces advanced northward, their confidence restored by the dramatic reversal of fortune achieved at Inchon. General Walker's forces, reinforced and resupplied through the secure port facilities at Inchon, began crossing the parallel on October 7 despite growing international concerns about Chinese intervention. MacArthur's recommendation to pursue the retreating enemy reflected his belief that complete victory was achievable before winter weather could complicate military operations. The international ramifications of the Inchon success resonated throughout the Cold War world as American allies gained confidence in United States military capabilities and resolve. NATO partners who had questioned American commitment to distant Asian conflicts now recognized that President Truman's administration was prepared to use decisive force when necessary to contain communist expansion. However, the seeds of future controversy were already germinating as MacArthur's forces approached the Yalu River and Chinese volunteer units began appearing in North Korea. The tactical brilliance that had achieved victory at Inchon would later be overshadowed by strategic decisions that brought China into the conflict and prolonged the war for 3 additional years. The human cost of the Inchon operation remained remarkably low compared to its strategic significance. Total UN casualties for the entire operation numbered fewer than 3,000, while North Korean losses exceeded 50,000 when prisoners, deserters, and combat casualties were combined. The speed of victory had prevented the prolonged urban combat that might have devastated Seoul. Colonel Puller's assessment of the operation, recorded in his personal diary now housed at Marine Corps University, captured the professional military perspective. MacArthur's gamble succeeded because he understood that sometimes the impossible becomes possible when executed with sufficient boldness and precision. The tactical innovations employed at Inchon would influence amphibious doctrine for decades. The technological aspects of the victory demonstrated American industrial and logistical superiority over communist forces. The coordination required between naval, air, and ground forces during the assault showcased combined arms doctrine that would become the hallmark of American military operations throughout the Cold War and beyond. President Truman's political standing was dramatically enhanced by the Inchon success, silencing critics who had questioned his Korean policy and providing vindication for the doctrine of containment. The operation proved that limited wars could achieve decisive political objectives without resort to nuclear weapons or unlimited mobilization. The strategic lessons of Inchon would be analyzed extensively by military historians and theorists, seeking to understand how inferior forces could achieve decisive victory through superior planning, timing, and execution. The operation became a case study in how technological advantages and professional competence could overcome numerical disadvantages. As winter approached and Chinese forces massed along the Yalu River, the triumph at Inchon seemed to represent the high watermark of American confidence in the early Cold War period. The operation had demonstrated that communist aggression could be defeated through conventional military means, but it also created conditions that would lead to a much larger and more protracted conflict. The port city of Inchon itself became a symbol of American military prowess and strategic innovation, its impassable tides and treacherous approaches forever linked with one of the most audacious military operations in modern history. The masterstroke that shifted the balance in the Pacific War had achieved its immediate objectives, while creating new challenges that would define the Korean conflict's ultimate legacy. MacArthur's reputation reached its zenith in the weeks following Inchon, but the very success that vindicated his strategic vision would contribute to the overconfidence that led to Chinese intervention and his eventual dismissal by President Truman. The operation remains a testament to the power of bold leadership and innovative thinking in warfare.